I'm Benjamin Day.
I'm Stephanie Nakajima.
And this is Medicare for All, the podcast for everybody who needs healthcare.
Woohoo. So first, an update on the Medicare for All bill. As of today, February 24th, almost 2 o'clock Eastern, we have about 75 original co-sponsors on the bill that's about to be reintroduced in the House, as it is every session, which is really great. But of course, we need to get as many as possible to show our strength on Medicare for All, which last session was over a majority of Democrats who co-sponsored. I think it was 106 original, and then ultimately 118 by the end of the session. And so we're going to actually have an action at the end of the podcast today. We're going to put up the Capitol switchboard on the screen, and so you can all call your legislators and ask them, either thank them if they are original co-sponsor or ask them to become one if they are not. But today, in light of the upcoming bill, we have a presentation on where we are with this bill and who are the next, 100 or so Democratic representatives who we need to get on to actually pass Medicare for All through the House, and a deeper dive into what it's going to take to get that majority that we need in Congress. So, Ben, take it away.
Let's not call it a presentation. It sounds boring. Let's call it a discussion, a dialogue. So,
right.
But one of the things we do, that we did, especially as we were switching from the last legislative session to this current one, was to take a little bit look at the districts and the co-sponsors we already have on board the bill, the Medicare for All bills in the House and the Senate. And how are they really different from the districts where we need to get co-sponsors on board the bill? So we're specifically looking at districts represented by Democrats, or swing districts that may off and on be represented by a Democrat, whose votes we really need to push this past the finish line. This was kind of we were looking mostly at demographic type data, political data, that sort of stuff. But there's some revealing stuff in here that I think is really important for all organizers and activists in the Medicare for All movement to sort of ponder as they switch from the type of organizing we've been doing for the last, insert number of years you've been plugging away at this here, compared to the next final stretch that we really need to win this thing. So, yes.
And for this presentation, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm going to put like a link to the presentation, the discussion images, so you can follow along, because this is actually like a whole slideshow that we put together, and there's actually another video on it on the YouTube channel, which you can also watch. But yeah, go ahead.
Right. I'm not going to torture you with the slideshow live, even if you're watching the video version. I'm just going to do the really high level stuff, and I'm going to try my absolute best not to just cite numbers after numbers after numbers and just give you the big picture here. So I'll start big picture geography. The good news is most parts of the country, most regions of the country, we have a majority of Democrats in the House are co-sponsors of the Medicare for All bill. A particular shout out to the Rocky Mountain region, who has 60% of their Democrats on board, which is the highest of any area. So big shout outs to Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. People may not think of those states as like the most successful in Medicare for All organizing, but turns out they are.
But also remembering that if the best that we have is 60%, we actually need 100% to get to the floor. So
yeah, word. So Rocky Mountain, you actually have quite a lot of work cut out for you. But the areas of the country where we have had the least success getting Democrats on board in the House, and this is no knock on the folks doing work in those areas, we just don't have enough of us in those areas, is in particular the Plains region. So this is, we're talking like Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, that area of the country. Only about 27%, about a quarter of Democrats are on board the bill in those states, but those aren't huge population states. So that actually isn't a huge chunk of like the co-sponsors we need. But the area of the country that is really important and jumps off the page when you're looking at the geography of our movement is the whole southeastern part of the country, where similarly we have less than a third of Democrats in that area on board, and there are a lot of Democrats in that part of the country. So this is, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Kentucky, all the way up to, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And this is, not just our movement, but I think in a lot of large-scale social justice movements, this is the part of the country where we have a lot of Democrats, but they are not as inclined to social justice issues, and we need stronger social movements. So that's the thing that jumps off the page with geography. When you look at politics, there's also some pretty striking differences between the districts where we have co-sponsors and the districts where we need to get co-sponsors on board. Of the 114, 118 co-sponsors we had at the end of last year, only 5 of them represented swing districts. And I know we have this whole back and forth with the centrist Democrats about, like, is Medicare for All a winning issue in these swing districts? And I think it actually is. But the truth is, very few of the districts we have organized so far are swing districts. And that could be part of this logic that DCCC is pushing, that you cannot run a Medicare for All if you want to win in a swing district. So of the remaining, the next 118 districts we need to get on board, where we had Democrats last year who were not on board, about a third of them were swing districts, interpreting swing pretty broadly as could go Republican, could go Democrat. And that doesn't mean, that the Democrats in those districts are any less progressive. It could just be that there's bigger independent bases, that Republicans are stronger in those districts. So that's another thing to bear in mind. We are going into a really different political terrain in the next districts that we need to organize. And similar, if you look at margin of victory, Democrats have these huge margins of victory in the districts we have organized compared to the other ones that we're going to have to organize. And then I just out of curiosity, I kind of looked at the demographics of the legislators themselves who were on board the bill at the end of last session versus the Democrats who were not on board. I looked at gender, and there's actually no gender difference between male and female reps, which kind of surprised me. I thought maybe women would be more likely to support Medicare for All than men. But when you look at race, different story. So of the first, of our co-sponsors at the end of last year, more than half of them were people of color, were Latinx or Black or Asian or Indigenous. And that is way out of proportion with the representation of people of color in Congress, let me tell you. And it really means that vastly disproportionately, the Medicare for All bill is being held up by leaders of color in the House of Representatives. And it's a really different picture when you look at the next 118 co-sponsors we need to get on board. Those Democrats who haven't signed on, about 2/3 of them are actually white, and only a minority, a third of them are people of color. And I won't go all the way into this. This is one of those things, if you really like data, you can pull up the slideshow and take a deep dive, but I did race and gender. And it turned out that women of color in Congress were way hands and above everyone else, the most likely to be co-sponsors of the bill, and were really disproportionately holding up the bill. And white women in Congress were the least likely to be co-sponsors of the bill. And I think we saw something like this just in this past election cycle, or I guess every election cycle, where women of color voters are kind of the most reliable Democratic voters and basically enabled the Democratic Party to win elections at all. So,
and this is how we repay them.
Yeah, thanks.
By trying to squash Medicare for All. I was reading some study the other day that was saying that a lot of times Republican women who are Republican or running for on the Republican primary actually tech pretty far right. I think we're seeing that with Marjorie Green Taylor, or whatever her name is. She's a perfect example of that. To win and to sort of differentiate themselves in their Republican primaries. And then sometimes it comes back to bite them when they get to the general and they've staked out all these really far right positions. But that actually, we're not seeing that on the Democratic side at all. We're not seeing Democratic women tack left to be competitive in the primary. And so I think that that's such an interesting, that white women are actually really sort of lagging behind on co-sponsorship. And I know that there's definitely some misogynistic reason and some intersection of conservative ideals and misogyny that's contributing to this. That's story for another podcast, but
Yeah, interesting. Also fucked up.
yeah.
I secretly in my mind, I envision like all these campaign consultants, the same ones who are like, you can't run on Medicare for all, even if you believe in it in a swing district, are like, sorry, this is how people perceive women in public, so you can't take strong
The pantsuit
progressive
nation.
positions. Exactly. All these fucked up consultants who are ruining our
Yep.
American democracy. And yeah, I think you're coming to us from Georgia right now, right? And Kelly Loeffler
I
definitely tacked right, but I'm glad it didn't work for her.
am.
So when you switch from looking at the demographics of the legislators themselves and look at their districts, which is far more important for our purposes, the picture actually looks very much the same. So of the districts where we have Medicare for All co-sponsor, more than half of them are majority of color districts. And when you look at the next 118 districts where we have to get a Medicare for All co-sponsor on board, where we have Democratic districts, fully 3/4 of them are majority white, only about a quarter are majority people of color. And I also looked at the income of these districts, the average income level. On average, the districts where we have a Medicare for All co-sponsor are lower income than the districts where we do not. But if you, if you break it out by majority white versus majority POC districts, it's actually a different picture. Majority POC districts are lower income than the current co-sponsor levels, which is the totally opposite trend. Whereas majority white districts are like way, way wealthier and much higher income, the ones that we need to organize. So there's something there. I'm not entirely sure what it is.
Rich people are bastards?
Yeah. And I think, there's this huge income gap between communities of color and white communities in general in the country. So part of it is a reflection of that. But part of it also, I think, may be that these majority community of color districts tend to be more solidly Democratic. So a lot of them have also figures in leadership who are very hard to get on board, but they can be like have very high percentages of people of color and very low incomes. So that could be sort of what's going on here. But I bring this all up not as a curiosity item, but just to highlight that although the general trend is that the districts where we need to get co-sponsors on board are richer and whiter and more, they're higher educated. They tend to be more politically contested with Republicans, tend to be more swing states. This is not actually the case for the remaining districts that are majority districts of color. There's actually a different kind of socioeconomic landscape in those districts. So the averages can hide some things. And in those, specifically those 31 districts where we need to win a co-sponsor, but they are majority people of color districts, they're overwhelmingly in 3 states. They're overwhelmingly in Pennsylvania, in Texas, and in Florida. 10 of them are in California, 4 in Florida, 5 in Texas.
There's definitely an extra level of disenfranchisement happening there, and an extra, I think, gap between like representation and constituents probably plays a role as well.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we all just watched what happened in South Carolina during the elections, so no shocker there. And I very quickly looked at the Senate, and I'll wrap this whole thing up so we're not stuck in a presentation. We can get to the dialogue. When the Senate, you can't really look at the demographics of states because states are so big and they hide so much if you just look at the averages. But I did look at the race and ethnicity of the co-sponsors in the Senate is pretty striking. At the end of last year, 80% of the Medicare for All co-sponsors, the 15 co-sponsors we had aside from Bernie Sanders, were white. Only 20% were people of color. A big chunk of that 20%, of course, was Kamala Harris, who's no longer going to be in the Senate anymore. And of the remaining Democratic senators who we need to get on board, over 90% of them are whites. Less than 10% are people of color. And that is just because, breaking news, the Senate is a totally racist institution. It's not a democratic institution. It doesn't reflect the population at all. And we have this, the United States is kind of, I don't quite know how it ended up this way, but we have a lot of small states with lower population that tend to be disproportionately white who still get equal representation in the Senate. So that's aside from racism in the election system. There's just this built-in kind of structural racism in how states are represented in the Senate. And, when I saw this, I was struck by the reason we're doing worse in the Senate than we are in the House is that we don't have the leaders of color kind of championing the bill in the Senate. We don't have as many to champion the bill in the Senate. So it's a really different, we have much, much further to go in the Senate. And I think, again, whereas one message in the House is we're going to have to tackle different types of districts in the House, in the Senate, we're going to have to tackle some of these states that are really economically, politically, demographically different from the districts and states where we've been having success so far. So I'll wrap up the fake verbal slideshow right there.
And, there's a lot of people who will ask us like, oh, I'm in AOC's district. What can I do? And it's like, well, that means you're also in Chuck Schumer's district, who is not a supporter of Bernie Sanders' Senate bill for Medicare for All. And so no matter where you are, Ilhan Omar's district, there's, I think, both senators there that are not on the bill. There's just the state work is also, we've almost feel like as a movement, we haven't even gotten there yet because we're still, working on building up in the districts, but the state work is also essential for us to actually win Medicare for All.
Yeah. And the truth is just to tack on really quickly, because we've had a Democratic majority in the House in the past period of time and not in the Senate, our whole movement has really been focused on the House more, I think. Because you can win incremental things like getting hearings on your bills when the Democrats are the chairs. The Senate we've been neglecting, but that has to end starting this session. That's going to be another big shift that we're going to have to make this year.
Exciting. So Ben, this was a lot of information. I'm wondering if we can, so super wonky, but super interesting. I wonder if we can just sort of zone in on like one or two states just to give sort of a case study and give give sort of an example of what we're talking about here.
Sure. Yeah, I thought about, there's a few states that are really strongly, I think, exemplify how the districts with co-sponsors are really different from the districts where we need to win co-sponsors. And I picked one of them, which is just New York State, that is, not New York City. And very briefly, if you look at New York, last year, New York had 14 co-sponsors on the bill in the House. But when you look at who those 14 co-sponsors are and which districts they represent, 9 of those districts were majority people of color districts. And almost all of them were in New York City, all except for 3 of them. And 2 of the rest represented like Buffalo and Albany. So they're still pretty urban areas. And then also at the end of last session, New York State had 7 Democrats who were not co-sponsors of the Medicare for All bill. So this represents the rest of the road that we now have to travel to win. And of those 7 districts, all of them were majority white, and only 2 were kind of heavily urban. One was on Staten Island, the other was Rochester. The rest of those districts were heavily suburban, heavily rural. They were much more politically contested with the GOP. 3 of them were swing districts, and actually 2 of them flipped Republican just in this last election cycle. So that, I hope, paints a little bit more of a detailed picture of like why things are going to have to look different with our organizing going forward. You can't just repeat the types of organizing and the places we've been doing organizing that we've been doing for the last X number of years.
Ooh,
so Stephanie, Island, I wonder,
Rochester,
no shit.
Any of those, I don't want to organize there.
Rochester, I think we should be able to win Rochester, but
yeah.
Anyway, side tangent.
Okay, that was sobering. Well, I think we should. So it was just so much information. I mean, what are our takeaways from this presentation? I guess for me, I think that this might be also very obvious. Thank you to people of color and women of color in particular for holding up our bill. Can I give a shout out especially to Ayanna Pressley, who, in Massachusetts, we have 9 co-sponsors and only 2 of them so far have actually committed to be original co-sponsors on this next iteration of the bill, and that is Jim McGovern and Ayanna Pressley. And that's just so important for us because it helps us, we have very precious constrained organizing resources. And so when legislators just jump on board without being asked a million times, and that just helps us to redirect to where we really need it to be. And so if only all of our original co-sponsors from last year or last session did that, that would be great. But what does this mean? If people of color are holding up our bill, then I think it's really time for white people to start talking about organizing white people. And of course, we're not going to win. We are not going to have to organize every single white person onto the Medicare for All bill. That's never going to happen. But I think that when we look at the remaining districts, there's probably a lot, like, for example, in my district here in Georgia 6, it is, heavily white, I guess you could say probably like 65%. So majority white. But there's also an area that's gerrymandered. So like just from like north of Atlanta, that's sort of like diluting the Black and brown vote there. And so I think that what's probably going to happen is that there's going to be coalitions of Black and brown people who care about Medicare for All and have been supporting it. And then also they're going to have to make a coalition with white people who are supportive of Medicare for All. And so I think that, that's just something that we talk a lot about, like, bringing in people of color into our movement. Well, actually, they've already been doing the work, and we need to focus on who we can peel off among ourselves as white people.
Yeah, and I think one takeaway that I think you could accidentally take away from this data is that it's actually time to be organizing like rich white people and rich white communities. I don't think that is the takeaway, or that we should be talking less about racial justice, or that integrating racial justice with the Medicare for All movement is somehow less important than we thought it was. And I don't think that's true. I think, in part, even in these predominantly white districts that we were talking about, racism does get weaponized in those districts to oppose universal programs like Medicare for All, and many, many others, kind of stoking racial resentment using dog whistles, is this going to cover illegal immigrants, all that type of stuff. If you don't have a message to address that, you literally can't organize, I think, white communities. So I think the racial justice message is equally, if not more important, in the road we have to continue to cover. But it is not the case that like the burden of getting this bill past the finish line now primarily rests on communities of color. I think that's the wrong message to take away, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it's exactly the reason we don't have Medicare for All is because of racism. So it's impossible to, I think, to think that we're going to pass Medicare for All without addressing that legacy. I mean, when I think about, Scandinavia, Denmark and Sweden and other Scandinavian countries, they built their much admired welfare state successfully because, the ruling class was less able, practically unable, to use race as a point of division among the working class. And so, now that those countries are increasingly multicultural and multiracial, the underpinnings of the welfare state are being questioned, and you're starting to see the weakness in forming a non-multicultural coalition. And because these, really white countries never had to apprehend their racism or xenophobia to get the great things that they have, their Medicare for their single payer system, their universal college and pre-K and all that stuff. And so I think that, we are part of a project that has never really been done before, I think.
Right. Well, many of them were large colonial countries, so they got to export their racism, not to the extent that the United States did. I'm curious what you think about, I guess the other aspect of this, aside from the racial justice takeaway, is the question of how does the left interact with the Medicare for All movement. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I think the first thing is that, most of these reps that we already have on in areas that are already represented by districts that are co-sponsors, they have a progressive movement infrastructure in Boston and New York City, where there are already established groups doing work on, not only, but including Medicare for All, but all the areas that the left is working on. And, I think that the areas that remain to be organized are just sort of less organized in general. And I'm not 100% sure that the force the vote sort of philosophy was like to build a Tea Party movement of the left. And I'm not sure that digging further deeper into the leftist infrastructure is really going to help us with these remaining districts. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I think that this is an interesting question. The strategy of building a Tea Party of the left to kind of drag the Democratic Party to the left, and I can see the logic there that if you could do something, there's no question the Republican Party has been dragged to the right, all parts of the Republican Party, to the point where the sort of middle of the road Republican almost doesn't exist anymore, in the House especially, but even in the Senate increasingly so. I think the other model that I look to more so, and I think that is a project that someone should take on. I don't think that's Healthcare Now's project. And that's because I think we look more to the social movements that have made major sort of structural changes in our country. If you're looking at the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, equal marriage movement, all these movements obviously had left and center and right of all those movements, right? So there was an organized left that was part of all those movements. And I think it's an important part of all those movements. But they were also movements that were able to build really broad coalition that was not just, rejuvenating the left. And they were able to appeal to kind of basic human values, to say, women being kept not allowed to vote violates some of our basic human tenets that we increasingly all believe in. Same thing with the civil rights movement, same thing with equal marriage, that it started to resonate with kind of a broader public that doesn't identify with the political left. So I kind of, from our perspective, I feel like, and especially when I look at this data about the districts we now have to organize next, I think if you're looking at one of these districts that we've already organized, you could probably organize the left in Boston and get your member of Congress to support something. But increasingly, all those districts we're looking at now, you can't just organize the left in those districts and get a member of Congress to co-sponsor the bill. And even in these big urban areas, I think when it comes down to a vote on a Medicare for All bill, when money is raining from the sky, the healthcare industry is fully mobilized in opposition. It's also not going to be enough in any district to just have kind of even a strong left. So I think we're going to need a strong left, but we're also going to need this much broad. There has to be a space in this movement for a lot of people who are not sort of strongly ideologically aligned. So,
yeah, and that brings us to, I feel like, another challenge that's sort of borne out through this analysis, right? As we move from a progressive left movement, the progressive left has taken us to where we are in this movement, to a place where we can really start to think about some of the end game stuff. And as we move from that to trying to build a broad-based, truly majority movement, I foresee challenges with the coalitions. I think, we're going to have to organize people, as you say, who don't politically align with the full slate of progressive positions. And, we'll have to enter into coalition with people who aren't always leftists. And we're going to have to also find ways to talk to people about things that positions that are going to be necessary for us to win. So, for example, abortion is in the bill, and abortion is very unapologetically in the bill. Not only does it guarantee abortion to everybody, but it also guarantees that that's going to be taxpayer funded, and undocumented immigrants are included in this bill. And it's a totally redistributive policy of enacting a progressive tax so that people pay according to their ability and not and then that's going to like really shake up who's paying what for this. And so I think that we have a lot of soul searching to do as well about like what the Medicare for All movement is going to look like and how we're going to get there, really.
Yeah, and I think we've had some of this change happen already, a little bit, but there's going to have to be a lot more. I mean, I think especially in 2017, 2018, we saw quite a few organizations who had been exclusively focused on like defend the ACA work start to shift into Medicare for All organizing work as the ground really shifted on Medicare for All, and there was like kind of a national surge of support. Even the term Medicare, indivisible among many others, right? Some of our best new allied organizations. And I think we're going to continue to see that. We're going to see groups who are kind of Biden and Clinton aligned organizations. I mean, we'll start shifting more and more into the Medicare for All camp. But it's going to make for some awkward bedfellows. And I think you just have to be able to work in coalition. And, again, it's not like, I'm not saying every organization has to be able to represent everyone or bring everyone into the movement, but we are going to have more and more niches within the movement. So
that could be its whole own podcast, I think.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Sometime. Yep.
I even see it a little bit. It's kind of interesting. We, in recent years, there's been kind of a growth of business owner involvement in the Medicare for All movement. And since our movement has been so strongly historically labor led, it's led to some interesting moments, even at like our conferences, where we've had some of our keynote speakers get up to the mic and say, capitalists are never ever going to back this. We just have to smash them and defeat them like we do at the bargaining table. And then a CEO comes up and says, "I just launched the Business for Medicare for All organization." So
I'm fine with business leaders being in our movement, just so long as they know that we're here to smash capitalism.
Right. Little side note on the end there. So yeah, I think it's gonna turn into an ugly but beautiful movement, as I sometimes say. So do we? I don't know. Should we look into our own backyard and talk a little bit about Massachusetts as we close out here?
I know all of our listeners in all 50 states love to hear about the tiny state of Massachusetts and what's going on here. So
I think we're contractually obligated to plug Massachusetts on every single podcast.
Sorry, everybody.
So yeah, like when I did this analysis of the country, and then I was like, oh, let me look at Massachusetts. I was actually kind of surprised. At the end of last session, we had 3 Democrats who were not on board the bill. We had Seth Moulton, who represents the North Shore. We had Stephen Lynch, who represents the South Shore. This is like just above and below Boston, along the coast. And then we had Richard Neal, who represents Western Mass, and obviously is a very powerful Democrat in the House. He's the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. And I was kind of surprised to see that those North Shore and South Shore districts were actually very white and very wealthy. It ran against historically how I think of those areas, because they have these old industrial cities in them, and these old kind of fishing towns along the coast that have kind of all of their industry has disappeared, and not all of it, but a lot of it has. So there's been kind of a rise of unemployment in those cities, and also they've become new hubs for new immigrant communities. But I'd kind of forgotten that they're also surrounded and gerrymandered into these giant, wealthy suburban populations around Boston, and that obviously these old fishing towns have also been significantly gentrified by people who like to live on the ocean and can afford to do so. And those districts are really, I think they fell into exactly what you had said earlier. Like, those are the parts of Massachusetts that don't have really dense social justice infrastructure. They don't have a ton of grassroots organizations that have foundation funding to do organizing work. They don't have a ton of unionized workplaces so that the unions are really active. They don't have huge industry. It's a
Or the
different,
unions are building trades unions that are traditionally more conservative.
different. Yeah, exactly. Good point. What we don't have is those are solidly Democratic districts. So we're not dealing with swing districts in this case. And even Richie Neal's district is the most rural of all the districts in the state. So that is also, we're not a very rural state in Massachusetts. Western Mass is really the only kind of heavily rural district that we have in this state. So I think we do, we are also trying to figure out now how we have to sort of shift gears to a different type of organizing. We can't just gather together the usual suspects and all right, let's build a coalition of all the grassroots groups and unions in this district and then throw ourselves against these reps. We're going to have to do, I think, more intensive grassroots outreach and maybe have some slightly different messaging too, and do some better listening, I think. So.
All of the above. I'm not sure if I really have anything to add to that. I think that it just, this is one of the things that I said about in my article about Force the Vote, is that people are rightfully frustrated about where we are as a movement. They saw that we made this big leap in 2016 or so. And then after that, it was sort of a trickle of new co-sponsors, and it wasn't the same energy. It wasn't the same proportion. And I think that this is the reason why, right? Because we've hit a lot of the low-hanging fruit, and now we got to start actually building new infrastructure, going into new places we haven't organized before. And there are no shortcuts, unfortunately, to that work. And, even if AOC and the squad can force a vote, we have to change those things. We have to change that political reality to actually make Medicare for all a reality, which is always my sort of North Star. How do we get there, right?
Right. Yep, I agree. All the three of those reps happily speak out against Medicare for all.
Yeah.
So they'd be happy to vote against it also, and it wouldn't change at all our chances of winning in these districts. And there's no 1 month, 2 month campaign that's going to help us get these three reps on. And I think it's the same around the country. It's going to be a really long-term base building campaign that's going to get us there. So in the spirit of organizing, should we do one last pitch for folks calling their legislators, since we are really trying to do this big co-sponsor push?
Yes. And one of the things I was actually going to say today, but didn't, was that, low-level actions like calling your legislator aren't going to cut it for these districts. And that is true, but it still means you should definitely call your legislator today as a start to kicking off our organizing in 2021. I think even if your legislator, you call them and you ask them to co-sponsor the bill and they say, actually, our legislator, Ayanna Pressley, is already an original co-sponsor, then please thank her for being a champion on Medicare for All. We want to encourage all of our legislative champions, and we want to pressure the ones who aren't quite on yet. So let me get up the phone number. That is the Capitol switchboard. Give them a call and speak your mind. Remember to tell your story.
Right. And if you're listening to the audio podcast, the Capitol switchboard number is 202-224-312. That can't be right. That's missing a number. It's 20.
Okay, hold on. Let me find it.
It's a COVID moment.
Epic organizing fail. Oh God.
Yeah, and I think
2-1.
Okay, so 3121 at the end. Okay. So resetting 202-224-3121 is the Capitol switchboard. And yeah, I think after you call them, find a bunch of your friends in the district to ask for a meeting with them if they are not already signed on. Because that's the next step. You have to escalate a little bit more. But we are going to get close to bill drop, and then shit's going to get real. So
exactly. And we should definitely have more organizing podcasts to talk about.
All organizing podcasts.
All organizing. Exactly.
All right. We'll talk to you all next time.
Yes. Thanks for joining us. Bye.